Well, it is always exciting to be back in Spain. You might recall our first ever travel episode was on Andalusia, and, I keep meaning to take my own advice and go back to Andalusia in December. The flights are incredibly inexpensive. I think it just gets to November and then December, and we've got too much on, and it just ends up not happening. You can see all our travels there so far in the Spain playlist, as well as Merida, more in the centre of Spain, but with just the most Roman ruins. And going back a little ways now, our episodes from the Balearic Isles. Anyway, I had planned this mini extended weekend. I don't know what you'd even label it, as if it even matters. It was just very slightly less than 4 days. And I was feeling devious, so I messaged around a few friends and said, okay, I have a trip coming up. Now look, I know all of you know roughly what's happening because you clicked on the thumbnail, but I said to them, look, do you trust me to take you somewhere amazing? Here's what we're going to do. I'll just tell you the dates and a bit on what clothes to pack, but I'll wait to tell you where we're going and what we're doing when you get to the airport. And bear in mind, the flights were pretty cheap as well. So imagine my face. We're all linking up at Gatwick for a certain time. I even have some photos in an envelope so I can do this reveal of here's where we're going. And as we walk into the terminal, this is just over 2 hours before we were due to fly, EasyJet cancelled our flight. So here's me doing a reveal to these people who've trusted me to take them somewhere nice, and it's shortly followed by, actually, EasyJet has grounded us in the UK, so if we don't find an alternative quick smart, we are in fact not going anywhere. Now, I'm leaning on a lot of spare B-roll of Gatwick I have lying around because, well, guess what? If you're frantically having to rebook an international journey on zero notice, it's not a good time to be absent-mindedly pointing the camera at the ceiling just for the hell of it. This was extraordinarily stressful, as you might imagine. Explaining it now, it doesn't sound like all that, but it was things like having to, for really stupid reasons, rebook the hire car, even though, on the clock, we'd be there, but just 12 hours later, and it was even just in one of those key boxes, so goodness knows why. Having to do that over the phone in a busy terminal, that was torture. But none of this admin kerfuffle is interesting to talk about on an episode, so here's what was on the table for us. No more flights into Madrid like we were supposed to, but we just made it onto a later flight to Alicante, and then we could catch a train the next day, and we'd miss out some time, but we'd be back where we would have been hopefully by about early afternoon. So we're on this Alicante flight. There's a subplot with just the loudest drunk Karen who was harassing flight attendants, just being the biggest garbage human being conceivable. She was starting fights with the parents of young children, and to the immense and audible satisfaction of everyone on board, as we disembarked, there were police waiting for her in the tunnel as we got off the plane. So all this hyper last-minute change was, very uncomfortable. So the nice enough last-minute Airbnb we got was a huge relief. The platitudes on the wall. One day I'm going to have to make a video on philosophy, just purely based on these most hollow of kind of empty statements written for Airbnb art pieces. Anyway, I'm trying to skim. We didn't linger in the morning to check out Alicante. We were on the first available high-speed train, and it was pretty great. Yeah, as for the British, for whom high-speed rail has become this huge sword we've fallen on, politically speaking, it is so weird to be in a country that has high-speed rail figured out and running well. So having landed a casual 420 kilometres, grief, from where we were supposed to be, we were in Madrid before noon, which was pretty incredible. Again, pardon us on a 72-hour trip where we'd already had about 16 hours docked by a cancelled flight. We didn't take the opportunity to do a vast tour of Madrid. We just looked for an improv brunch somewhere about 10 minutes walk, and hence a bit cheaper and nicer than the station. And then linked to the airport and finally into a hire car and out of Madrid and to where we were supposed to be. This is Segovia. And after all that, I'm not going to delay this anymore, just cue all the aqueduct shots. No, more aqueduct shots. So Segovia is a beautiful place, and yes, has this whacking great how did this even survive aqueduct, which just totally slaps. And so now, rather than a night and a morning in Segovia, we just had a couple of hours. But after all the stress it took us to get to this position, I will take it. And taking this espresso vanity shot and feeling like I could finally breathe again. We didn't just ogle the aqueduct, of course. We headed further into town, got a glimpse of the cathedral and the walls. funny enough, one of the most incredible things to do in Segovia is get out of the town and cross to the opposite side of the valley to the south and admire the ridiculous views of the castle, walls and cathedral, all of which is also begging for a supercut. Interestingly, despite its unreal size, the aqueduct is completely masked from view from this angle, but you can see Segovia is so much more than just that. So this was a rush. It was getting later in the afternoon and we wanted to get on our way to our next accommodation, so all too soon it was out of Segovia. Now, I'm actually really annoyed with myself. I can't think why, but normally by this point in filming episodes over the years, I'd have the courtesy to my future self to at least get some shots from the road, to kind of be connective tissue in the edit, but for whatever reason, I didn't on this trip, so I'm having to borrow these shots from Malaga, which is not exactly next door, so that's dumb. The scenery in the immediate vicinity of Segovia was not dissimilar to this, pretty great, not life-changing, let's say. So my footage actually picks back up again when we arrived in the early evening at Avila. Now, Avila, a bit like Segovia, has a particular card to play for which it is most famous. It has this amazing circuit of medieval walls, but also like Segovia, it is a lot more besides, and the wall encloses a gorgeous medieval core, but all of this we will get to. So a wash of cloud had sort of blunted the colours a little, but got my first peek of the highlights on a quick circuit. We were overdue a decent meal, which looking back, I also didn't film. This is not like me. It may have been at the time I decided against making this into an episode and I was just going to take the medieval and ancient highlights. If that was my attitude at the time, I have of course since backpedaled. Anyway, as you're seeing, we caught some of the cathedral at night. We were much more relaxed this evening, as a day that started with us still partway through managing a crisis had transformed into a wonderful surprise. And having got my friends there on the promise of, look, just trust me, it'll be worth it, it was nice to see Segovia and Avila and confirm, yes, this was worth it after all. Well, up early and it kept getting better. Let's have a supercut. So I was having the best morning, just circling the walls, finding different compositions, and other details besides, such as this, the Hermitage of San Segundo with its rather delightful Romanesque details. Kept going round the sort of northwest circuit of the walls and then into the town. Looking back at this footage, there's this one shot of an espresso, which I'm going to have to loop a moment. This trip actually coincided with my birthday. Always a good excuse to do something fun. You don't need to know when that is precisely. I live in the perpetual fear that I'll put out too much info on this channel and someone will open a checking account in my name. But just taking a moment at a quiet coffee spot in this gorgeous town in central Spain, right before the clock ticked over to mark another year. It's just one of those little moments which, it's pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Full disclosure, the espresso was, just okay. But I'm sure you will have these small, seemingly unremarkable moments, but you can just remember the exact feeling of being there like it was 5 minutes ago. That node that hotwires you right back to that particular moment. Well, not about to spend the whole morning pondering my existence, there was still plenty more to see. There's a couple of different sections to the wall that you can get onto. It doesn't make it all the way around the city, but it's pretty much just the western section that isn't open. And this area by the east offers you great views of just about everything. Dropped in on the museum, there's a lot there, including a mosaic floor, various Islamic-era tombstones, and all manner of Roman sculpture, even Roman pipes used to transport water. But here's something I was particularly excited about. We've already released a trailer for our Hill Fort series, which is coming out in just a few episodes' time now. But in the UK, while various monuments and structures are visible in the landscape, art and sculpture from this pre-Roman era are much more rare, save for smaller pieces in museums. Well, in this region in Spain, you can find these curious sculptures known as the veracos, whichever. These are stone-carved pigs from around 2,000 plus years ago. And while the name literally means boar, there are some that are other animals like bulls or possibly a bear. Anyway, while time has of course worn away some of the detail, and I think some of the ones around the town might be reconstructions, it was still great to finally see some of these for myself. A few more bits from around Avila. This is the Basilica of San Vicente, built around 1175, although it took centuries to complete. It has this beautiful mausoleum inside. Okay, technically this is probably a cenotaph, but despite its later Gothic additions higher up, it's actually an incredible example of Romanesque polychromy at the earlier levels. At least in the UK, we're accustomed to seeing art from 800 plus years ago as bare stone, which, I'm down with, but invariably, these monuments, as originally finished, would have been a riot of colour. We also got to go inside the cathedral, which is quite a treat. It's not entirely clear its exact date of construction. It may have been from the 1000s, being built inside the ruins of a previous Romanesque structure, or it might be a little later from the 1100s. Either way, it's one of the two earliest Gothic cathedrals in Spain. And the view here down the nave is gorgeous. I'm going to outsource this to a supercut of the cathedral inside and out. So we were nearly out of time for Avila. There was time for just one more thing on our way out. On the western side of town, just over the river and on a small rise, is a monument that also affords you just gorgeous views of the town, particularly the walls. It depends what time of day it is. Given the eastern viewing aspect, an afternoon to evening will be better lighting-wise, but it's a great chance to see the town. And next, with a bit of a drive, the distance between Segovia was not too bad, but the road to our next stop is best part of an hour 45 on the roads, circumnavigating to the southern side of Madrid. But having made up the distance, we found ourselves looking out over, and this is going to need some unpacking, Toledo. First of all, just appreciate these views over the valley. Actually, rather than supercutting here, I can just talk over it while you enjoy these. Toledo is an incredibly special place in Europe, and I don't in the slightest bit hold it against you if you're not aware of its history. Having gone from a high point at the beginning of the 1000s, where the Islamic Caliphate of Al-Andalus was dominating the Iberian Peninsula under Abd al-Rahman III, while Christian petty kingdoms had started to make some ground in the north over the centuries since the initial Islamic conquest in 711, Abd al-Rahman had been very successful in his military campaigns and brought Al-Andalus into something of a golden age, which is why it was a dramatic turnaround when his successors would end up fracturing this once prosperous realm into a series of infighting city-states known as the Taifas. And sure enough, the Christians in the north could use this fracturing to their advantage, and in a campaign unthinkable even 50 years previous, they drove south and after a siege in 1085 took Toledo in the centre of Iberia, driving a huge wedge across the land. But what happened next was way more significant than just an exchange of territory. Toledo became something of a bridge from Islamic scholarship into medieval Europe. This is a huge topic which merits much more discussion, and one day, the series on Al-Andalus, which, I've been anticipating many series. Getting this series on the Venetian Republic out was just goals, but I cannot tell you how excited I am to one day finally get the series out on Al-Andalus. Anyway, Islam in the centuries between 7 to 1000s was academically leagues ahead of Western Europe, whether it was mathematics or astronomy or medicine or just access to ancient Greek writings that Catholic Europe at the time found distasteful. The capture of Toledo allowed for an incredible cross-pollination of Muslims, Jews and Christians who could work on translations of manuscripts and, in general, connect Europe to the intellectual world of Islam at the time in a way scarcely seen anywhere else. Suffice to say, the city as it stands is a dizzying blend of Ostrogothic, i.e. pre-Islamic sites, with Islamic and later Christian architecture, even a few Roman bits too. It's this tightly packed town overflowing with historical details tucked down its numerous side streets. Now, this had turned into a bit of a difficult trip. Sure, it had mostly turned around by now, but after the horrible shock of having to resort everything, this is my birthday present to me, okay? I'm going to delve around Toledo, looking at various ancients and medieval sites. Sue me. So, after arriving in mid-afternoon, after a fair distance from Avila, the first thing we did, and I'd recommend you do this, Toledo sits on a rise in a major bend above the Tagus River. And a bit like Segovia, if you just go beyond the limits of the town to the other side of the valley, you are greeted with extraordinary views, the sort we've been already treating you to. It was pretty hot. Being outside for long periods was turning into a bit much. Anyway, to avoid attempting to drive into the tight historic streets of Toledo, which really, really were not built for the car, we parked in a big parking lot to the northeast and walked up the hill to our hostel. Then, after dropping our stuff and taking a breath, we headed out to see a few bits. First off, after a couple of turns, the Cuevas del Hercules, or the Cave of Hercules. This rather fanciful title is actually a name bestowed on a Roman site where these huge subterranean arches were originally part of a Roman cistern, but it was suitably grounded. It saw later use in the Visigothic period as a church and then in the Al-Andalusian period as a mosque. Following that, the Roman baths, a bit fragmentary, again sinking below the modern street level, but the heritage site has done its best to bring the area to life. A quick glance at the cathedral. We were close to the closing time for many historic sites around the town. This was formerly a mosque that has survived surprisingly well. I know I was talking about Toledo in glowing terms of tolerance and convivencia, but let's not get carried away. After the Christians took the city in 1085, their first priority was not preserving the Islamic architecture of the city, so the level of preservation for this structure is remarkable. There's even a garden in the Islamic style on the site. Okay, I have actually forgotten what we did for dinner that evening. Sorry all, but again, this is 18 months ago now, and in the absence of footage, so cut to next day, early scamper through the town. I was struggling to find the good coffee early doors. The day was split between various sites. We dropped back down the hill to the northeast to check out, well, okay, I thought this was the ruins of an aqueduct. You know, if you look at these, they kind of look like the collapsed spans of a Roman aqueduct, right? I mean, you know, here's Lyon in France or Termini in Italy. You see what I mean? Well, anyway, turns out this is actually the ruins of a Dominican convent built around 1229, although there had been an earlier church structure on the site. Not far away, if you follow the line of the walls, you have the Bisagra Gate, some of which is from the 900s and has some Islamic design, although there are later layers, so you can see. Just inside here, the Church of Santiago de Arrabal is a real treat. And a moment just to explain a term. Mudahar is a term that describes, amongst other things, art or architecture made by Christians in Iberia but emulating elements of Islamic design. You know, each region has its own peculiarities, so Toledan Mudahar is subtly different from Andalusian Mudahar. But as I'm sure you can tell, it's more than a little noteworthy that far from the conflicts in Spain being this death struggle between two ideological opponents who loathed each other, it's not like, oh, gross, get this Islamic architecture out of here. No, the exact opposite. Christian kingdoms were highly enamoured by Islamic architecture, emulating it long after the peninsula was fully conquered in 1492. Now, back to the church, you can see all sorts from the apse decoration to the horseshoe arch of the door. I was just going to go in when some people came out the door and locked it behind them, so I just missed it, but no matter. Back up the hill. Next, there was a large crowd descending on this particular spot, so we doubled back for a drink and then a quick foray into this church. It's Baroque, that's not normally my jam, gotta be honest, but its towers gave a great view over the city. Then after a drink, we headed to the Visigothic Museum. Yeah, this is where we might veer into unrelatable territory. Before the Islamic invasion of Spain, there was a Visigothic era from the loss of Roman and Vandal control till 711. It's about 300 years. That's comparable to the era of Roman control in Britain. And the more scholarship and archaeology we do on Visigothic Spain, far from being a dark age, it's a wellspring of sculpture, art and culture. And this museum, housed in the Church of San Roman, is an incredible chance to see the richness of this culture. It includes some reproduction Visigothic crowns, which were discovered in burial sites. I mean, can you imagine actually burying these? Anyway, I was shooting everything I could. It was a real treat. From there, I think I sat the group down in a restaurant so they could relax while I scampered around. I was very conscious. I was attempting to mine the riches of Toledo in less time than I really should have. So, the Iglesia del Salvador, this is one of the main Visigothic survivors in the city, as well as a church and several arches. It has some archaeology in, well, less than intact condition, showing the early church ruins from here. Got a brief view of the town from the roof level. Then, taking the next bit at a jog, this site is the Synagogue de Santa Maria la Blanca. It's a synagogue replete with horseshoe arches. It's quite an incredible place from either the late 11 or 1200s. We're not entirely sure. We think it's got some sort of Almohad influence there. It's hard not to be won over by the rows upon rows of columns and arches. Anyway, linking back up with the group, and with the skies somewhat greyed, we headed to the Iglesia Mozarab de San Sebastian at the end of town, originally built in the 900s. Then looking across the valley, the ruins of the Islamic bathhouse. It's a little bit of a wreck, open to the elements, not the greatest state of preservation, but let's have a quick supercut. Well, we were conscious of the ticking clock. We briefly had a drink as spots of rain began to fall. Then we looped out via the Alcantara Bridge to get back to the car. And then just one last thing, this is a medieval bridge that, along with the Alcantara, was one of the main entrances into the town from the south. This was in the 1300s. But with the clock finally ticking down, we needed to head north to Madrid and catch our return flight, which thankfully was scheduled as normal. Okay, so final thoughts. You can tell that I was using this trip as an excuse to catch ancient and medieval sites, but look, when are we not? That's every trip. If it seems a bit brief, when I was doing research for these places, there are tours advertising these exact 3 cities in that order in just one day. So please don't jump down my throat about not lingering long enough in each of these. Apportioning 24 hours to each was a reasonable time span, though you could easily stretch that into 3 days each and have more than enough to explore. Despite the fiddle, I have no regrets. I am thrilled we got to see these places. I feel happy that for the friends I surprised with these locations, they were spectacular enough to merit a few days out of work in the UK. Anyway, as mentioned, we've got a Spain playlist where we explore Andalusia and the Balearic Islands. Otherwise, you can see more of what we're up to with the Venetian Republic playlist, which is probably the thing we're most proud of. It begins way up at Adriatic Slovenia and then down via Croatia and Montenegro, and there's a lot more to go in there soon as well. So yes, plenty more to check out. If you've enjoyed the music in the background, that's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can catch it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support the channel, that's the place to do it. Otherwise, please find us on all the socials, and we'll catch you very soon.